Hey, good morning, Revelstoke Alliance Church. For those of you who weren't able to make it to the Sunday service and want to keep up to date with the sermon series that we're doing in Acts, thank you for joining us online. So this is our 33rd sermon in our series in Acts. It's been going for a couple of years, and we're coming towards the end of the book of Acts as Paul is beginning to go through the process of being arrested, and we'll see how it plays out. We've read lots in the book of Acts so far. We've read about the day of Pentecost. We've read about the death of Stephen, the conversion of Cornelius, the Roman centurion. We've read about the various missionary journeys that Paul's been on and the teams that he's put together and the cities that he's been to. We've worked through a lot of miracles and sermons and prayers and persecutions. And last week we read about how Paul returned to Jerusalem after finishing his third missionary church planting journey, and then he gave a detailed report to the church in Jerusalem about all that God had done through the churches in the Gentile nations. We finished up with James asking Paul to participate in a Jewish purification ritual, as the rumors circulating around the church were that Paul was trying to actively undermine the Jewish roots of the Christian faith. So Paul obliged, and he joined 4 other men in completing this Jewish purification ritual. And that is where we pick up today. This is in Acts 21, verse 26. The next day, Paul took the men and purified himself along with them. Then he went to the temple to give notice of the date when the days of purification would end and the offering would be made for each of them. When the 7 days were nearly over, some Jews from the province of Asia saw Paul at the temple. They stirred up the whole crowd and seized him, shouting, "Fellow Israelites, help us! This is the man who teaches everyone everywhere against our people and our law and this place. And besides, he's brought Greeks into the temple and defiled the holy place." They had previously seen Trophimus the Ephesian in the city with Paul and assumed that Paul had brought him into the temple. Now, you may remember back in chapter 19, Paul spent 2 years preaching the gospel in the city of Ephesus, and quite a few people were converted. But this stirred up quite a lot of opposition as well, in the form particularly of a man called Demetrius the silversmith, who complained that his idols of Artemis that he made his living from was simply not selling as well as before. And so he stirred up a riot against Paul, false accusations. Paul had to flee, almost cost him his life. You can read all that in Acts chapter 19. Now, while some Jews from Ephesus at this point in chapter 21, some Jews from Ephesus are in Jerusalem and they see Paul there together with Trophimus, who is a Gentile convert to Christianity. They assumed that Paul had brought Trophimus into the temple, which was completely forbidden at the time. Bringing a Gentile into the inner courts of the Jewish temple was punishable by death under Jewish law. So just like in Ephesus, a crowd starts to form, being stirred up against Paul with this false accusation that he brought a Gentile into the temple, which he never did. Verse 30, the whole city was aroused, and the people came running from all directions. Seizing Paul, they dragged him from the temple, and immediately the gates were shut. Now, this shutting of the temple gates is highly symbolic. Luke, the writer of Acts, is saying here that the act of thrusting Paul out of the temple and dragging him off to be killed just because he follows Jesus is the last straw for God in regards to the temple. You may remember that Jesus had warned the Jews that the temple would be destroyed if they refused to listen to God. And about 20 years or so after this incident in Acts 21, the Roman army did actually come into Jerusalem and burn the temple to the ground, and the temple was never rebuilt. But here we see the doors being closed, Paul being thrust out, and this crowd is going crazy. Verse 31, while they were trying to kill Paul, news reached the commander of the Roman troops that the whole city of Jerusalem was in uproar. He at once took some officers and soldiers and ran down to the crowd. When the rioters saw the commander and his soldiers, they stopped beating Paul. The commander came up and arrested him and ordered him to be bound with 2 chains. Then he asked who he was and what he had done. It's a very interesting way of doing things. Arresting someone, binding them, handcuffing them, binding them with chains, and then asking him what he had done. A little bit of a backwards situation. Some in the crowd shouted one thing and some another, and since the commander couldn't get at the truth because of the uproar, he ordered that Paul be taken into the Roman barracks. So when Paul reached the steps, the violence of the mob was so great he had to be carried by the soldiers. The crowd that followed kept shouting, "Get rid of him!" Now, I don't know if you can imagine that scene. The crowd was so unruly, the yelling was so loud, the Roman commander was completely unable to hear a word that Paul was saying. So he takes Paul, bound in chains and arrested for nobody is sure quite what for, and orders him into the Roman barracks. The crowd, meanwhile, were ready to tear Paul apart limb from limb. Verse 37. As the soldiers were about to take Paul into the barracks, he asked the commander, "May I say something to you?" "Do you speak Greek?" he replied. "Aren't you the Egyptian who started a revolt and led 4,000 terrorists out into the wilderness some time ago?" Paul answered, "Well, I'm a Jew from Tarsus in Cilicia, a citizen of no ordinary city. Please let me speak to the people." After receiving the commander's permission, Paul stood on the steps and motioned to the crowd. When they were silent, he said to them in Aramaic. So, we've got lots of assumptions going on here. The crowd assumed that Paul had brought a Gentile into the temple. The Roman commander assumed that Paul was some Egyptian gang leader ahead of a terrorist organization. Now look, I don't know if you noticed here, Paul is using his different language abilities to further God's work. He speaks in Greek to the Roman commander. Greek was the main language of the day throughout the Roman Empire. And then when he starts speaking to the Jews, he speaks in Aramaic, their native language at the time. Paul is quite prepared to use any acceptable means at his disposal in order for people to be able to hear the gospel. So we have a crowd of Jews trying to kill Paul. We've got a Roman commander who thought he was an Egyptian terrorist. And through all of this chaos, Paul sees the opportunity to do what? To spread the good news about Jesus. Talk about being bold in your faith, being wholly sold out for Jesus. I think many of us would just be trying to survive the situation, but Paul is looking to save the souls of the people in the crowd. In the next chapter 22 and verse 1, this is in Aramaic. Paul is speaking now to the crowd. "Brothers and fathers, listen now to my defense." When they heard him speak to them in Aramaic, they became very quiet. Then Paul said, "I am a Jew, born in Tarsus of Cilicia, but brought up in this city, Jerusalem. I stuttered under Gamaliel and was thoroughly trained in the law of our ancestors. I was just as zealous for God as any of you are today. I persecuted the followers of this way to their death, arresting both men and women and throwing them in prison. As the high priest and all the council can themselves testify, I even obtained letters from them to their associates in Damascus and went there to bring these people as prisoners to Jerusalem to be punished." Now, Paul is given here a personal testimony. He's witnessing to the crowd about who Jesus is and what he's done in his life. And he starts off with kind of explaining what his life was like before he met Jesus. Now, the way that Paul does this is a great example for you if you want to share your faith and your story and your journey. As I say, he starts off with explaining of what his life was like, who he was before he met Jesus, just so that the crowd could see where he's coming from. Verse 6. "Now about noon, as I came near Damascus, suddenly a bright light from heaven flashed around me. I fell to the ground and heard a voice say to me, 'Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me?' 'Who are you, Lord?' I asked. 'I am Jesus of Nazareth, whom you are persecuting,' he replied. My companions saw the light, but they didn't understand the voice of him who was speaking to me. 'What shall I do, Lord?' I asked. 'Get up,' the Lord said, 'and go to Damascus. There you'll be told all that you have been assigned to do.' My companions led me by the hand into Damascus because the brilliance of the light had blinded me. A man named Ananias came to see me. He was a devout observer of the law and highly respected by all the Jews living there. He stood beside me and said, 'Brother Saul, receive your sight.' And at that very moment, I was able to see him. Then he said, The God of our ancestors has chosen you to know his will and to see the righteous one and to hear words from his mouth. You'll be his witness to all people of what you've seen and heard. And now, what are you waiting for? Get up, be baptized, and wash your sins away, calling on his name. Paul continues on here, retelling the events of his meeting with the resurrected Jesus, about his conversion, his acknowledgement as Jesus as Lord, his healing of his blindness, and his baptism. So if you are sharing with someone about Jesus, retelling them the events of how Jesus met you in your hour of need, and how you turned from your previous sins and how you responded by being baptized, it's a very powerful way to share your faith. If somebody knows you personally, like your neighbor or your work colleague or a family member, it's hard to dismiss a personal testimony about salvation. People can argue about facts or about opinions, but when you share your own experiences, that is an extremely powerful way to get across the truth about who God is. Verse 17. When I returned to Jerusalem and was praying at the temple, I fell into a trance, and I saw the Lord speaking to me. Quick, he said, leave Jerusalem immediately, because the people here will not accept your testimony about me. Lord, I replied, these people know that I went from one synagogue to another to imprison and beat those who believe in you. And when the blood of your martyr Stephen was shed, I stood there, giving my approval and guarding the clothes of those who were killing him. Then the Lord said to me, go, I will send you far away to the Gentiles. So Paul continues here with what Jesus had done in his own life, sending him on a mission to bring the gospel, the good news about Jesus, to the Gentiles or the non-Jews. See, Paul thought that his previous violent stance against the church maybe disqualified him from being part of God's mission in Jerusalem. He reasoned that since the church knew he'd been against them, he didn't have any credibility with the Christians. And the Jews now knew that he was a follower of Jesus, so he didn't have any credibility with the Jews. And so he didn't know about how and what he should proceed with his faith. He thought he would be rejected by everyone in Jerusalem. But instead, God used that broken bridge that Paul had with the Jews in Jerusalem and sent him instead to go preach to the Gentiles. God can use something that seems to be broken, that seems to be out with his plans, and turn it into something amazing and incredible and marvelous. Now we know that the Jews regarded the Gentiles as unclean, uncircumcised, pork-eating idol worshippers, who in their eyes were the enemies of God and everything that God stood for. And now Paul had just told them that God himself had sent Paul to go and preach to the Gentiles. Amazing. The story continues, verse 22. The crowd listened to Paul up until he said this about going to the Gentiles. Then they raised their voices and shouted, rid the earth of him, he is not fit to live. As they were shouting and throwing off their cloaks and flinging dust into the air, the commander ordered that Paul be taken into the barracks. He directed that he be flogged and interrogated in order to find out why the people were shouting at him like this. As they stretched him out to flog him, Paul said to the centurion standing there, is it legal for you to flog a Roman citizen who hasn't even been found guilty? When the centurion heard this, he went to the commander and reported it. What are you going to do? He asked. This man is a Roman citizen. The commander immediately went to Paul and asked, tell me, are you a Roman citizen? Yes, I am, he answered. Then the commander said, I had to pay a lot of money for my citizenship. But I was born a citizen, said Paul. All right, this is what we call a plot twist. The Roman commander was about to torture Paul with a cat of 9 tails, just as they had done to Jesus before he was crucified. It's a whip made up of 9 strands of leather, each studded with sharp iron. It gets whipped, the person gets whipped around the torso, and as they take the whip back out, it tears away all the flesh. Basically, an enhanced interrogation technique, torture. They were about to try and torture Paul into confessing whatever crimes he had committed, judging by the riot that was happening outside. Now, the reason why he was going to torture Paul was because he couldn't really understand what Paul had said to the crowd. Paul was speaking in Aramaic. This commander spoke Greek. He wasn't sure what was happening. So interrogation with torture it was. And just as they're about to start whipping Paul, they've laid him out, they stretched him out. Paul speaks up and says, is it legal for you guys to flog a Roman citizen who hasn't even been found guilty? I've not even had a trial yet. Are you allowed to do this? Now, you see, the majority of people living in the Roman Empire were not citizens of the empire. They didn't have citizenship. They were either slaves or part of a subjugated people. So what did it mean to be a citizen at the time of the Roman Empire? Well, you could become a citizen one of three ways. First way, the preferable way, that you were born a citizen, that you were a child of a citizen and you got citizenship. Second way, by buying citizenship for a large sum of money, just like this Roman commander had done. And the third way, by earning it, by serving for an extended period of time in the Roman army, you could earn citizenship. If you were not born into it, it was either a very expensive process or a very long and difficult process. Now, what rights and privileges did Roman citizenship bestow upon you? Quite a few. So I'm going to run through quickly the different rights that you had as a Roman citizen. You had the right to vote for the different Roman assemblies. You had the right to run for civic office. You had the right to make legal contracts. You had the right to hold property. You had immunity from paying Roman taxes and other legal obligations. And citizens had the right to access the Roman court system, to sue or be sued, and even appeal a court ruling to Caesar himself and have Caesar hear the court case. They could also not be tortured or whipped or given the death penalty unless convicted of treason against the state. Now, these are some powerful protections you had as a citizen. And Paul had them as a citizen, and this Roman commander was almost about to violate it. Verse 29. Those who were about to interrogate Paul withdrew immediately. The commander himself was alarmed when he realized that he had put Paul, a Roman citizen, in chains. You see, if that commander had flogged a fellow Roman citizen, he would have been in a massive amount of trouble himself, so he ceased immediately. Now, citizenship and rights and privileges that go along with it is something I do know a wee bit about. When Steffi and we moved to Russia in the 90s, it was almost impossible to get a visa to get there. For those of you born in the 90s or later, Russia used to be called the Soviet Union. Soviet Union was 14 different countries. Russia was the biggest one in there. The Soviet Union had been in what was called the Cold War with the West for almost 50 years. No citizen of the Soviet Union was allowed to travel outside of their borders unless they were sportsmen or they were going on government business, a euphemism for spying. Likewise, a bit loud in the volume there. Likewise, no Western citizen was allowed to go into the Soviet Union again unless it was on government business. It was very, very, very rare. There was basically no tourism in or out of the Soviet Union in those 50 years. And then the Soviet Union collapsed politically, 1991. And after they did, they opened up their borders in a very limited way for a small number of their citizens to travel to the West, and for a very small number of Western citizens to travel to Russia. Hardly anyone was allowed in or out on a tourist visa. You had to enter in on a business visa. So 18 months after that collapse of the Soviet Union, and Russia's trying to piece itself together and figure out how to move forward, Steffi and I, 18 months later, Steffi and I managed to get business visas to enter Russia. But we were obviously not citizens. We were just visitors on a limited 6-month visa. And that was a single entry visa. You could only come in and out of Russia once in those 6 months. So you could come into Russia, you could stay there for a maximum of 6 months. Once you left, your visa was finished and you had to apply for a new visa. So we had no rights, no privileges, no protection, no government protection. And every 6 months we had to leave the country and head either to Helsinki in Finland or to Tallinn in Estonia or maybe even Riga in Latvia for a new business visa and then return back to Russia. It was a long an expensive and repetitive process of traveling back and forth we went. We have lots of stories about border crossings and armed guards and smuggling. We weren't smuggling, other people in the train were smuggling goods across the border, and the guards would come in with machine guns. Crazy time, interesting stories for a different occasion. And then one day, I got hired on by the British consulate in St. Petersburg. I became an employee of the British government. And they now handled my visa situation. And I was issued with what then was the gold standard for visas. It was what every foreigner in Russia wanted, this visa. Very, very few had it. And I was given one, a multi-entry 1 year visa. So the visa lasted 1 year instead of 6 months. It was multiple entry. I could go in and out without having to get my visa renewed every time. And the British consulate renewed it automatically for me. So that was awesome. That was great having that visa. I was still not a citizen, but at least it was definitely a step up from the 6-month business visas. But Steffi had to keep on leaving Russia and coming back on a new visa every few months. Then God directed us to apply for a visa to come to live in Canada. Back then it was called landed immigrant status, but now I think it's called permanent resident status. We started that process off, and it ended up costing us about 20,000 Canadian dollars in government fees, immigration lawyer fees, medical expenses, translation fees, the flights to Canada. It was about $20,000 all in all to get our permanent residence visas for Canada. But it wasn't the end of the story. Although we had some rights as permanent residents in Canada, we didn't have all the rights. We weren't citizens, and so we couldn't vote, we couldn't run for office. If we were to get into some kind of difficulty abroad, the Canadian government didn't have a responsibility to help us. We weren't citizens of Canada. But eventually, after many years, we applied to become citizens. We studied for the exam, and we paid even more money, and we passed the exams, and we took the vows, and we became citizens of Canada. Finally, we could vote. Finally, we were protected by our government. Finally, we could fully participate in the country that we lived in. After almost 20 years, or more than 20 years, we could be citizens of the country where we lived. And so we took our vows to the Queen to uphold the laws of Canada and to be good citizens of this country. Now, for me, that meant I was a citizen of two countries. I was a citizen of the UK and Canada. And so it was great. I had to be loyal to the Queen twice over, once by birth and once by vows when I became a citizen of Canada. So after all these struggles and dollars and forms and exams and vows and ceremonies, I am finally a citizen of Canada. All my kids had to do, they didn't have to go through any of that. All they had to do was just be born here. Because I was a citizen, they got citizenship. And that was just like Paul. He was born a citizen of Rome. The army commander had been through my experience. He had to go through the whole process of purchasing his citizenship at a great cost. But Paul was simply born. Now, why tell you, you might ask, I can hear you asking, about all this about citizenship and rights and privileges? Well, because Paul, who was a Jew by religion, born in a Greek city in Tarsus, which is Turkey, but born as a citizen of the Roman Empire, he wrote this in his epistle to the church in Philippi. Listen carefully to what he wrote. This is Philippians chapter 3, verses 20 and 21. But our citizenship is in heaven, and we eagerly await a Savior from there, the Lord Jesus Christ, who by the power that enables him to bring everything under his control will transform our lowly bodies so that they will be like his glorious body. You see, all these boundaries and borders and governments, they absolutely affect our day-to-day lives. They affect where we can travel to, where we can vote, what protections we have. So they absolutely have a consequence on our day-to-day lives. But as Christians, we have a far greater citizenship. Our citizenship is in heaven. The world is not our final home. Canada is not our final home. The government is not our final authority. These civil protections are not our greatest protection. Our identity is not wrapped up in our ethnicity or nationality or earthly citizenship, although they have great effect to our day-to-day lives. But our identity is firmly anchored in our status as citizens of heaven. Thy kingdom come on earth as it is in heaven. We pray it every week. That citizenship takes ultimate precedence. That is where our hope is. That is where our lives are. That is our ultimate authority and protection. Not the government of whatever country or city that we happen to be living in, whether we are a citizen or not. Now, we absolutely should be a good citizen, obey all the laws of the land as far as you possibly can, as far as possible, as long as it doesn't go against your citizenship in heaven. Now, when you become a heavenly citizen, you need to be all in. You cannot follow Jesus and follow the world. You cannot worship money and worship God. You can't give your ultimate allegiance to Caesar and still be a citizen of heaven. Now, if you were at the service on Sunday, this is where I would be displaying some photos of Steffi and I getting our Canadian citizenship. We were all happy, flying the Canadian flags. What I didn't say, and I wanted to say on Sunday, was that what we did immediately after becoming citizens, we did the most Canadian thing we could think of. We went to Tim Hortons and rolled up the rim. And I won a donut. So what a great day. I became a citizen and I won a donut and roll up the rim. Totally awesome. Anyway, I was really happy to become a citizen. But for me, it wasn't like a massive deal. It was more convenient for sure. I mean, I have added Canadian citizenship to my British one. I still had the foot in both camps. I was a citizen of two countries. I can switch passports whenever it's most convenient for me when I'm traveling. But if you saw the other photograph that I displayed on Sunday, you would see the sheer joy on Steffi's face. Just incredible. Why is that? Because she, unlike me, she had to give up her German citizenship in order to take up the Canadian one. When she became a Canadian, she was all in. She exchanged one citizenship for another. She was and is entirely Canadian. So what about you? As following Jesus, are you all in? Have you exchanged your worldly citizenship for your heavenly one? Or do you have a foot in both camps? Do you have like a little bit of a security backup plan? Well, if this Jesus thing doesn't work out, then I'm going to just go away and do this. Or I'm mostly following Jesus, but I'm kind of doing this over here. No, you got to be like Steffi was when she became a Canadian. She was all in. She had to give up all the other stuff. And so if you have one foot in the world and one foot following Jesus, can I strongly encourage you to be all in for Jesus? To be like Paul. To rely upon your heavenly citizenship. So yes, be a good citizen. Yes, you have rights and privileges attached to those citizenships. But that is not where our hope lies. It's not where our heart lies. It's not where our ultimate allegiance lies. That lies with Jesus and with heaven. And then there's one more passage I want to share with you today about exchanging our citizenship of the world, that comes with sin and lust and greed and everything that comes along with that, and exchanging it for a heavenly citizenship, which is one based on faith and obedience and sacrifice. Let me read this to you. Paul wrote this as well. Hebrews chapter 11, verses 8 through to 16. I'm going to be not reading all those verses, but most of them. By faith, Abraham, when called to go to a place he would later receive as an inheritance, obeyed and went, even though he didn't know where he was going. By faith, he made his home in the promised land like a stranger in a foreign country. He lived in tents, as did Isaac and Jacob, who were heirs with him of the same promise. For he was looking forward to the city with foundations, whose architect and builder was God. All these people were still living by faith when they died. They didn't receive the things promised. They only saw them and welcomed them from a distance, admitting that they were foreigners and strangers on earth. People who say such things show that they were looking for a country of their own. If they'd been thinking of the country they had left, they would have had opportunity to return. Instead, they were longing for a better country, a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them. Amen. All right, join us next week when we continue on reading about what happens to Paul now that he is in custody of the Roman commander, but he has not been charged with anything yet. So we'll continue on tracking with Paul as he goes through his trials and tribulations. Thanks for joining us. I'll see you on Sunday. Bye-bye.